Then I'd like to welcome the next speaker, lovely Umayam, who is a DC-based nuclear policy analyst who also works to bring the issues of nuclear policy to a wider audience. So she is a perfect kind of speaker to have at the Einstein Forum. Thank you for coming.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I feel very honored to have this platform to share my thoughts about the bomb. So I actually stand before you as someone who unintentionally stumbled into nuclear things. And this accidental encounter has propelled me into a 7-year journey to study and work on nuclear nonproliferation issues. And this experience has really challenged the way that I look at the world, our interactions with nature and each other. And that might come off as overly dramatic, but it's true. And I want to use our time together to show how nuclear issues, especially the bomb, doesn't have to be a technical and political topic that we passively deal with when it comes up on the news from time to time. Rather, I think it should be a topic that is at once universal and deeply personal. And so this is a presentation that's different from the previous 3 in that those were, as I think Martin called it, an exercise of nostalgia. But mine is, it hopes to complement the presentations because it's more of an invitation to imagine new futures. I've actually retitled this presentation to Seeing Nuclear, because after working on this talk, I realized that this is truly about unpacking the relationship between seeing and understanding. Seeing helps us understand the world around us. One of the pioneers of data visualization, Edward Tooft, likes to refer to this as a thinking eye, the inseparable experience of seeing information, processing that information, and ultimately absorbing it as part of one's worldview. So when it comes to nuclear issues, particularly nuclear weapons, what exactly do we see, and how does this affect the way that we understand the world? So for the most part, the public, I think, sees nuclear in 2 ways. The first is as a myth-like abstraction, as we already talked about earlier, a black box. It's, seeing its contours, but never its contents. Nuclear weapons policy is explained through specialized language that anthropologist Carol Cohn calls techno-strategic language, which is intentionally coded, meant to only make sense to a special, supposedly worthy group of people, policymakers, and military men in the war room, as well as the RAND types that Lorraine described earlier. And for the rest of us, a shroud of secrecy remain around nuclear weapons, reinforced by images and stories of scientists toiling in secret in order to harness the power of nuclear science in the name of national security. The second way we see nuclear is as a plot device to ultimate annihilation, and this is a nod to Martin's presentation. Spencer Wert, the author of Nuclear Fear, A History of Images, traces this back to fantasy novels written in the early 1900s that explored the dark side of the atom. What you see up here are the first 2 novels of that sort. The Red Book on the right, Robert Cromie's Crack of Doom, is about a mad scientist and his mission to merge humanity back with the universe, which is grotesquely romantic, by transforming us all into plasma through some sort of atomic fission. The book on the left is from the infamous H.G. Wells, who we already talked about earlier, and this is titled The World Set Free. And it's one of the first to describe the consequences of war because of a weapon that's unleashed an uncontrollable amount of atomic energy. And forebodingly, the novel starts with a sentence, and I quote, "The history of mankind is the history of the attainment of external power," end quote. And I wonder how that ends, right? So these novels were revolutionary during their time of publication, But a century later, this plot is rather played out. Earlier, we talked about how we are saturated with images that essentially has rendered the loss of potency when we talk about the core message of why nuclear weapons are bad. And today, we mostly encounter atom bombs as the villain's weapons of choice today to destroy humankind, mostly seen in movies. Just a few weeks ago, I actually recorded a podcast for a local cinema house in Washington, D.C., and the owners and I talked about the idea of nuclear weapons have become MacGuffins. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the term MacGuffin, but it's a film terminology that it's reserved for characters in movies that are not developed in themselves, but are used as accessories to move the story and other important characters forward. Superhero movies are quite guilty of this. This is a scene from one of the more recent X-Men movies, X-Men First Class, where the mutants find themselves in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is Magneto using his magnetic powers to stop the American and Russian bombs from hitting Cuba. It's really silly if you step back and think about it, but while watching movies like this, who's really thinking about anything? In any case, the recurring use of nuclear weapons or even nuclear accidents as Hollywood ornaments stem from horrific historical incidents: the US nuclear attack on Japan and the accidental explosions in Chernobyl and Fukushima that are seared into our collective memories. So these two ways of seeing, I would argue, leaves us in an undesirable place. On the one hand, we are always exposed to deeply disturbing nuclear images without the opportunity to understand what it is or given agency to do something about it. We are accustomed to consuming mushroom clouds, but ill-equipped to engage in real-time debate on the nuclear threat that North Korea now poses, or the United States' recent decision to leave key nuclear agreements behind. Last year, the Pew poll found that around 70% of Americans surveyed have heard little or nothing at all about the Iran deal, the multi-state agreement that aims to limit and monitor Iran's nuclear program. The words Iran and nuclear are coupled in the public imagination, but most people don't understand its practical realities. So this is an example of where nuclear is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And this goes back to the title of this event: how do we talk about the bomb if we flattened it to make nuanced, meaningful discourse impossible? In our current flattened situation, we have come to accept deterrence, using the threat of nuclear weapons to dissuade a country from attacking as the only valid option for surviving our nuclear world. And I would argue that deterrence is alive and well because the countries that possess nuclear weapons continue to believe in and insist on their value, as seen in presidential speeches or tweets, as well as official documents declaring a country's nuclear posture. Within the past year, we've seen Russia boast new hypersonic missiles that can carry nuclear warheads, China seek advanced nuclear-armed submarines, and the United States flirt with, and I think it was Rob who mentioned, $1 trillion budget for nuclear weapons modernization over the span of 30 years. Arundhati Roy, a renowned author, grieves this current state of existence as the end of human imagination. We have given nuclear weapons so much influence that we are beginning to lose sight of what it means to live without them. If we continue down this path, we will never see a nuclear weapons-free world. So there was actually a point when I lived in a nuclear flatland, and this is one of my favorite childhood photos when I was still in the Philippines. As a Filipino-American immigrant who grew up in Los Angeles, California, which is a place that introduced me to race and class consciousness, environmentalism, and other social justice issues, atom bombs never crossed my mind as a threat to myself or my family. What I learned in history class about the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was overshadowed by thrilling stories about nuclear codes and radioactive monsters. I was never encouraged to confront the reality of these weapons because the images I consumed made bombs feel distant, fantastical, and flat. So it is quite odd for someone like me to wander into the world of nuclear policy, a professional field I never aspired to enter, let alone even knew existed. So how did I end up seeing nuclear differently? And what led me to this is actually story. I was fortunate enough, with the help of teachers, mentors, and colleagues, to appreciate the multivalent nature of nuclear through different stories. Great stories rise, they fall, they have arcs and twists. It's not a landscape of dull information, because stories serve to take us places. So the first compelling story I heard about nuclear weapons was this. In college, I learned that China's understanding and pursuit of nuclear weapons was not based on Western deterrence thinking. Rather, Chinese nuclear weapons policy was initially influenced by the Maoist ideology that claims nuclear weapons are nothing but paper tigers, a hollow demonstration of American superiority. Nuclear weapons are things that look frightening, but in truth have no real power, only a tool for imperialist blackmail. So in the mid-50s, the Chinese set out to show that communists have the political will and fighting spirit to also build this technology, rendering American blackmail useless. And I found this hyperlocal narrative so striking that it led me to live in Beijing to learn about Chinese nuclear history. And as an aside, this is actually consistent with China's decision to have an unusual force structure. Experts estimate that the Chinese has less than 300 weapons. So their strategic calculation isn't about more, but to diversify and spread it over land, air, and sea. So understanding a country's pursuit of nuclear weapons require knowledge in knowing the stories that matter most to people in that country. Our first speaker yesterday, Mr. Mohammed Hanif, talked about how creating the bomb is an extension of national myth. And I would say that this is also true for the Chinese. A few years later, I had an opportunity to travel to Vienna, Austria, to participate in an international conference to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. There, I witnessed how nuclear diplomacy was essentially a power struggle between the haves and have-nots. The 9 nuclear weapon states that continue to brandish their weapons with impunity, while the rest of the world grew embittered by the lack of parity. And this is why the recent passage of the nuclear ban treaty in the United Nations is actually considered radical in the nuclear expert field, because it is a product of discontent with double standards and a rebuke of existing treaties and frameworks that have failed to rebalance the scales. And so this is ultimately a story about seeking retribution and equality. And during my 3 years in government, I encountered a mosaic of stories, ideas, and policy positions. Nuclear as a symbol of political power, as an economic driver, as an environmental savior, an environmental abuser, as colonial exploitation, and as a terrorist threat. Learning about these different vantage points was not just about becoming a better, more informed nuclear policy analyst, but it also ushered a transformation of self. And starting out in my career, I would often simplify my job description as someone who researches nuclear materials and technology so that they don't fall into the wrong hands. But 7 years later, I find the statement packed with complexity. I've had to do some soul searching as I continue to work in a country that is arguably becoming irresponsible in the world stage. And as we just talked about in Susan's presentation, has been quite irresponsible for a while now. And isn't it fair to say that nuclear materials and technologies are already in the wrong hands as nuclear weapon states modernize their nuclear arsenal and delay any meaningful action towards disarmament? So over time, the nuclear flatlands, for me at least, transformed into peaks and valleys, terrain that holds a multitude of meanings. These also beg a wide range of emotional responses, wonder, anger, and hope, that make the topic more complex and ultimately more human. Historian Gabriel Hecht coined the term nuclearity to describe this diverse, complicated, and even contradictory terrain, which is constantly changing depending on who we are, where we are, and our moment in time. So I believe that great stories are key to escaping nuclear flatland. They will help us truly question the notion of deterrence, the dominant narrative echoed across the flatland and ingrained in our minds as the only rational way of surviving our nuclear world. But for most of you, the last thing you want to do is spend years learning about Chinese nuclear history. This kind of scholarship that I pursued shouldn't be the only way. I am optimistic about finding alternative paths out of this flatland in order to democratize nuclear knowledge. And I do want to emphasize that I believe that the public, everyone in this room, is a forgotten constituent in this issue. This is the New York Times front page back in June 13, 1982, covering the largest anti-nuclear weapons demonstration in US history. The crowd estimates were about 500,000. I have to admit I was not born yet when this happened, but it's inspiring to know it happened, and there was so many people at that time who felt like this mattered. Our collective thinking and action about the bomb might not look like this today, and perhaps this moment in time will never be replicated. But I think it begs us to ask, what does it take to have a critical mass of people care again, short of experiencing another nuclear attack or disaster? I believe it's a matter of reclaiming our imagination. This brings me back to the idea of seeing. I am reminded by Argentinian novelist Cesar Aira, who said that art creates new values, intervenes in the personal history of the spectator, creates taste, and offers a new gaze. To create art is to tell story. And this is not just about seeing the art on the page or the wall, but what happens in the intervening process between eyesight and mind. Through the process of seeing, a seedling of an idea or story is forever planted up in here. So these past few years, I've decided to challenge myself by continuing the deep policy research that I love to do, but also adding on a new set of missions to share what I know, particularly the grand stories that I encounter as a nuclear policy expert to everyone else around me, to create a gateway out of the nuclear flatland so that others can access, share, and debate narratives that would allow for a richer experience of our nuclear world, and to use the arts and the power of the thinking eye to build this gateway. So I wanted to share with you this thing that I created called Bomb Shelto, which is my way, my portal out of the nuclear flatland. It is a policy and arts collective, a collaboration among nuclear experts and artists with the goal of producing beautiful but deeply researched pieces to encourage a different way of seeing nuclear things, and by extension, opening the mind to new nuclear stories. I have 3 projects I'd like to share with you before I close. Nuclear as a story about land. Nuclear weapons would never exist without the special ingredient found deep in the earth, uranium. Back in 1939, before the bomb was born, Albert Einstein sent US President Roosevelt a note saying that the United States has poor ores of uranium in moderate quantities. While the US government depended on the Belgian Congo for its uranium, it still pursued uranium at home. It just so happened that most uranium-rich spaces in America are also the most vulnerable and sacred native land. There are over 500 abandoned uranium mines across Navajo Nation today, the largest area occupied by Native people in the Southwest United States. What you see here is actually the summit of Mount Taylor, located in New Mexico. This mountain is a sacred place to the Navajo, Acoma, Laguna, Hopi, and Zuni Native American tribes. It also happens to be the site of the largest uranium belt in the United States. and was mined from the late 1940s until the late 1970s, primarily for military use. Around this time frame, New Mexico apparently produced more than 118,000 tons of yellow cake, about 40% of the national production at that time. Today, as the United States government builds improved warheads, or even low-yield warheads, albeit that it's now with plutonium and not uranium, it has done little to repair the land that provided the original source of this military power. So these are just photos from another site, Shiprock, New Mexico. And it houses a large repository for uranium tails, and it's close to another sacred mountain or rock face in New Mexico, and this is the Shiprock. So Ways of Knowing is the title of the project. It's a multimedia project in collaboration with Navajo community members that places the audience in Navajo territory and invites them to see land as a living, active entity, the main character of this story, scarred by American nuclear legacy. One of the art pieces under Ways of Knowing is a 360 virtual reality film, and this is the camera here that you see, that transports the viewers into Navajo land so that they too can feel, to some extent, what it means to live intimately on beautiful yet contaminated land. This project also features the work of Navajo and other indigenous communities who are helping restore the land through community building and traditional ecological knowledge. So the two people that you saw there wearing the 360 VR headsets, the first one, her name is Tina Garnanes, and she's a Navajo documentary filmmaker, and she did a film about her family's story with uranium mining because her grandparents were miners, and they were severely affected. The second individual is Professor Perry Charlie, who is an environmental scientist in the University of New Mexico, Shiprock, and he has teamed up with Navajo scientists to develop a geological terminology in the native language of the Navajo, Diné, so that they can talk about uranium and radiation contamination in their native tongue. And here are just some more pictures that we've gathered from our time with Navajo community members. And I think that the most surprising and humbling lesson for me is to recognize that my own conventional nuclear expertise has limitations, and that I lack the most important kind of knowledge of all, the lived experience in understanding the impact of the bomb. The second project is Nuclear as a Story About Coalition. The Color Curtain Project, in contrast, tells a story far away from a uranium mine or missile silo, but is potently nuclear nonetheless. It remembers the meeting between newly independent African and Asian countries in 1955. Diplomats gathered in Bandung, Indonesia, eager to forge new coalitions and plan a future free from colonial rule. But the advent of a new superweapon, the atom bomb, and at that time there were 3 nuclear weapon states, the United States, Russia, and England, cast a shadow over their conversations of freedom. So the Color Curtain Project recalls the triumphs and failures of the Bandung Conference in a contemporary setting, a dinner club gathering individuals of African and Asian descent in Washington, D.C. Through this interactive art installation, we encouraged reflection on the meaning of Afro-Asian solidarity on local issues, but also global concerns, including the need for nuclear disarmament. Each guest that we invited received this book, which also served as a menu, 3 chapters reflecting the 3 courses of the night, each encouraging conversations about the political and social issues that entwine the African and Asian experience. The 3rd chapter, titled The Problems of Dependent People, is about the bomb. And I actually have the physical copy here if anyone's interested to look at it. In developing this project, I learned that one of the most vocal diplomats in favor of disarmament in Bandung was the Filipino representative, Carlos Romulo. He argued that the American and Russian bombs could shape the future of the world, but only if the world allows it. He urged his fellow diplomats to take hold of their own narratives, to champion cooperation instead of threats of violence. Romulo asked his colleagues pointedly, "What is the model of freedom that we seek? How can we be masters of our own fate?" And I wanted to show the participants of this art installation that the voice of a non-nuclear state should be given equal power. This is a story about how countries and people can come together to reject a world order dominated by the bomb. And now, I'm beginning an exciting but admittedly intimidating project to examine and deconstruct the story of fear. Through illuminating radioactivity, we challenge ourselves to redefine our collective understanding of radiation, a word that brings about strong reaction and opinion, but continues to be deeply misunderstood. How many of us here are horrified of radiation, but could not explain what it actually is? I'm actually really curious. A celebrated creative tried a similar exercise in 1956, Walt Disney. He and his artistic team, in collaboration with German physicist Hans Haber, created an animated film called Our Friend the Atom to educate the public about the potential gifts of nuclear energy. I also brought the book version in case anyone wants to see it. Disney's approach was quite clever. He opens his film with an allegory comparing scientists who discovered the atom to a fisherman who accidentally finds a magical lamp to bestow it whatever he desired, power or peace. Mind you, Disney wasn't, his intentions weren't at all altruistic. He received US government funds for this project. But nonetheless, he did try to demystify the atom with art. And I wanted to share with you a contemporary take on this exercise. I share with you this art piece by Nona Garcia, an artist based in the Philippines. This piece features x-rays of delicate animal bones arranged in mandala shape, an ode to her childhood, watching her parents, who are both doctors, use medical radiation devices to see through patients and address their ailments. This life-size collage are not photographs. These are actual x-rays taken with a special light box that she laboriously developed and pieced together. So in her case, radiation is a source of artistic inspiration, a beautiful memory of her family, and reminder of one's fragility and vulnerability. So under this project, we will be creating a book and digital exhibition to be out around the summertime, with the goal of making the invisible visible and the ways in which radiation, physically and figuratively, permeate our daily lives. So nuclear issues can be dizzying and overwhelming, and unleashing a multitude of nuclear narratives to the masses could lead to clarity or perhaps even confusion. And some may even call it revisionist or treasonous, akin to the crucifixion of the Enola Gay exhibition. But as a nuclear policy expert, I am compelled to do something new and creative. And I think that if we do not act, nuclear will forever lay flat, pinned down by the heavy narrative of deterrence. In his renowned book, Sapiens, Yuval Noah Harari discussed how the human power to invent stories may have played a big role in our eventual dominance as a species. Our unique communal capacity to believe in what we imagine give our stories so much power that they can exert great force back onto the world and restructure our way of thinking and living. This is the hold that imagined constructs and imagined orders like corporations, religion, or even nuclear deterrence have on our lives. But I want to live in a world where nuclear doesn't immediately incite fear, but perhaps instead recall responsibility and respect. When we talk about the bomb, I don't want to start from a place of losing defense, arguing up against an uphill battle against the rationale of deterrence. Rather, I want us to all immediately reject it because the creation and development of nuclear weapons is inherently irresponsible and thus unacceptable. But we cannot achieve this if we confine our imagination to a single plane ruled by a single story. I think that we must open ourselves to new frontiers where a multitude of powerful narratives await. Last thing, since I've started illuminating radioactivity, I've been thinking a lot about atoms. Working on this project reminded me that while there is an intimate association between atoms and nuclear weapons, atoms shouldn't be corrupted or tainted by this relationship. Perhaps it's helpful to use atoms as our first port of call, a reminder that the concept of the atomic need not immediately bring weapons or destruction to mind. Instead, it may help to remind us that atoms are the building blocks of the universe, a shared characteristic with the sublime. Framed this way, atomic knowledge and practice demands responsibility and our respect. And to complement physics with poetry, I'd like to close with a line from one of Walt Whitman's poems. For every atom belongs to me as good belongs to you. For every atom belongs to me as good belongs to you. So how can we bring this level of introspection into our conversations about the bomb? With that said, I'm done. I bid you all a good journey out of this nuclear flatland. Thank you.
So it's a great project, and I really hope you're successful. But I want to play devil's advocate for a moment and say that stories and translations into Native American languages and reminders of demonstrations are essentially ways of preaching to the converted, right? If we think of the biggest demonstrations in human history, they were the worldwide demonstrations against the start of the Iraq War. And we know how that turned out, right? So what worries me is that there are a lot of people out there in many, many countries, including all the nuclear countries, who couldn't care less about nice stories and, you know, all our fears and attempts to kind of reinterpret the atom, et cetera, et cetera. So what do we do about people who don't want to listen to any of this?
Oh, sure.
I want to make Misha's question even stronger. Just visually, since your talk was about seeing and understanding, I worry about how beautiful a lot of those images were. I mean, the last one, the Nola Garcia,
Yeah.
you know, it's like a mandala, you know, you could, you know, take it with a joint and or without one and think about sort of psychedelic kinds of images. The Navajo images were very beautiful, many of them about the land. And I worry that you're aestheticizing something on a level that I find, as Misha does, hard to see exactly how we're going to develop the kind of political consciousness we need using those images. For that, it seems to me the really unbearable images that Martin was talking about this morning might be more useful.
So I really appreciate that question. It's something that I grapple with, and I would say I don't have a clear answer or defense, but I have a couple of points I'd like to make. The first is I'm not necessarily arguing that we do away with horrific images. I think these serve to flatten our experience of the nuclear. And so what I'm trying to offer are different entry points in which other people, particularly my generation, to understand nuclear in different ways. We've already talked about earlier how there is this distance generationally because I did not grow up in a place where I was required to duck and cover. And so mushroom clouds are in some ways already romanticized and science fictionalized, if that's a word. And so I think that if we stick to that dominant image, we may be shutting the doors to other opportunities to bring the next generation into the conversation. When I present the Ways of Knowing project to my peers, for example, I'm slightly reframing it such that it's not just a nuclear question, but it's an environmental question. And that becomes a story about reckoning with our past and how can we continue to modernize our nuclear arsenal without giving back to the land that we exploited to create these arsenals in the first place. And that is a very compelling justice issue. And it's not just about, a fear angle. I would argue that in some ways it's amplified by giving it this additional dimension to complicate the situation. And a person who may not necessarily be a nuclear policy analyst, but is an environmentalist, is now compelled to look at this problem as well. So that's sort of the idea. I don't mean to say that we shouldn't continue to show the inhumanity of nuclear destruction, but rather if that isn't an entry point for someone, how can we build new ones, new gateways for those people to be at the table and feel like they can care? The second point that I wanted to make is that I think just from my experience traveling the world and talking to different people about nuclear issues, destruction, unfortunately, is not the only point of reference they have. For example, I was just in Jamaica last December, and Jamaica has the only research reactor in the Caribbean. They don't use highly enriched uranium anymore. They were able to downblend and use LEU, low enriched uranium. So that's not necessarily an issue anymore. But when I talk to the scientists, they don't have the same mushroom cloud fear reference point that we have. Actually, they're very proud of their research reactor because it actually helps them conduct experiments. One of the great experiments that they like to share to people who visit is that they use the research reactor to date coffee beans, and it helps verify the authenticity of Jamaican coffee. That is the reference point of what nuclear can mean for Jamaica. And as a nuclear policy expert who goes to these countries, also an American nuclear expert that goes to these countries, I ask, are you worried about the safety, security of these facilities? And they say that, no, because we have little nuclear material that can be stolen, and we have other priorities to take care of, like drugs and crime and actual issues for that particular place. And so, again, I think over time, I initially came from a point where my only reference point was the big boom, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and after 7 years of working, I am compelled to reach people where they're at, and better understand where they're coming from, and there perhaps have a bigger conversation about nuclear, so that way they could start caring about these larger issues, specifically the bomb. Hopefully that's, helps to some respect, but I am not going to pretend that this is not an experiment and I know that it's going to work out. I don't know that, but I'm willing to try, because I am very aware that my generation does not care and does not want to talk about the bomb.
I mean, it sounded just for a second as if you were making, or at least from using the example of Jamaica, making the case for a low impact, low yield version of nuclear proliferation, a source of, as Mohammed was talking about last night, a source of dignity and pride for a small country. Okay, maybe it doesn't have to be a nuclear bomb, but is that the other side? I mean, because the question is, if you're not emphasizing the dangers and the destruction, what is the aim of the analysis then? To make people more aware of nuclear policy as an issue, or
yes, and going back to your point about dignity and pride in nuclear, it does exist in the form of peaceful uses for the atom, not peaceful uses in terms of the way that India and Pakistan have talked about it in terms of peaceful nuclear tests, but peaceful uses of the atom for research, for energy, and we could debate whether that's peaceful, but it goes to show that there are countries and individuals who believe in that kind of peace. And and that's something that I have to contend with, grapple with, when I'm in international spaces talking about nuclear policy. For instance, one of the biggest debates right now is around the idea of nuclear security. And that's a highly specialized term of securing nuclear not nuclear weapons, but nuclear materials and technologies so that non-state actors can't get a hold of them, right? It's not about Iran or North Korea building the bomb, but having a terrorist group get enough to create a dirty bomb or an improvised nuclear device. And it's actually a highly contentious issue, because there are some countries that think that that becomes a barrier to peaceful uses. I mean, that's something that Iran, and perhaps Iran's a bad example, but they talk about how, the nuclear weapon states cannot talk in good faith about non-proliferation, preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, if they keep their bombs. And so who are they to prevent other countries like themselves, like Iran or others, from acquiring nuclear material and technology to advance the sciences? That's a real debate that's happening, and that's something that I'm seeing and have to, again, confront whenever I'm in those spaces. And I think that that's lacking, that kind of complexity in the way that we talk about nuclear is lacking in the public, because it's framed as just a conversation about the bomb. But I would say that the people who are in power, people who make influences in nuclear policy spaces, that's not the only calculation.
Martin Schott.
I'm curious about the second of the three projects you proposed, the coalition building, and you've chosen one historical example. Will you be looking at more attempts of coalition building?
I would like to, but even the Bandung conference is complicated enough that I think I may spend some time with it. But I've been talking to a lot of artists and non-nuclear experts who, when they think of nuclear, they think of nuclear sites, missile silos, uranium mines, but they don't think of policy as nuclear spaces. And as a policy expert, that's where I live. I look at the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. I look at these key arms control agreements. And the Bandung Conference is helped catalyze what is now called the non-aligned movement, which is still a political bloc that has influence within the nuclear community. And the non-aligned movement is a majority of the countries that don't want to align with the Western powers when it comes to these types of issues. I say that Bandung is complicated because while I spent time talking about the Filipino representative, I could have also talked about Zhou Enlai, who is the Chinese representative, and there are also Nehru, the Indian representative, and the Pakistani representative is Muhammad Ali Bagra, I think. And those are three representatives who attended the Bandung Conference, countries or representatives of countries that ended up pursuing nuclear weapons. And I think that that's incredibly complicated, right? Because as I mentioned with Chinese nuclear history, 1955, that's also the same time that the Chinese started thinking about nuclear weapons. And so, I think that in that case, there is contradictions and hypocrisy. I think that when I think of nuclear, that those two terms come to mind. And I want to spend some more time looking at that because even non-nuclear states are compelled to go nuclear. And I think that one could argue that the non-aligned movement is ineffective. A lot of people say that the Bandung Conference was a failure, and I see both sides. So to go back to your question, I think I'm going to be spending a lot of time with Bandung.
Because I like the idea behind it. If I may ask a follow-up question, that seems to me to offer a way for the dignity issue to be reframed as one of we're proud and we stand tall because we have no military use of the atom. That reminded me of something I came across in my talk. The infamous Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire declared itself nuclear free. And immediately thereafter, there was a whole coalition of local councils in the north of England that declared themselves nuclear-free zones. Mm-hmm. That was of no consequence because British nuclear weapons were and still are and probably always will be in Scotland. They're always in Scotland. They're not in England. But it made them proud. It gave them a certain dignity that had a function of making them popular, as an example. So the idea that coalition building may function by simply rejecting deterrence has its precedence.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, and going back to the initial question of how effective this approach is, ICANN, who helped spearhead the nuclear ban treaty, I mean, this is part of their message, right? It's not just about the destruction of the bomb, but the injustice of the bomb. And part of the types of stories that they tell are about the production process of the bomb. You don't have to detonate the bomb to be a victim of it. I think a lot of people forget that there is a lead up to the making of the bomb that is not just about the physicists in national labs, but real lives that were sacrificed. And that has become a really effective story for the nuclear ban treaty proponents, because it's not just about getting to the boom, right? Because deterrence is about preventing the boom. When you start talking about, well, what did you sacrifice to get to that point that's quite inhumane, then that's another layer of argument that, nuclear weapon states have to deal with. And even the nuclear ban treaty, I mean, it's quite controversial in the nuclear policy field. A lot of, even myself, I don't know how to feel about it, because it's a symbolic gesture of changing the norm, because the norm doesn't work, frameworks don't work anymore. And I think it's a great shakeup, because it's making us rethink stories in ways that bring new characters in. The fact that now you could also hear from indigenous communities, Marshall Island, victims. It's now just packaged into something that's so much more potent, that is the ban treaty. And a lot of experts, I would say, who believe in deterrence are quite annoyed by it, because it's challenging the dominant narrative, and I think it's great.
Soviet missiles, so I guess you would have a story to tell, although unlikely that Germany will sign it, which is very sad.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Oh, sorry. I missed your son.
I actually wanted to go back to the question of aesthetic, because I think that there is a difference between, I know what you're talking about, because, for example, within the space of environmental justice, one of the big problems is when National Geographic has these beautiful images of plastic bags floating in the ocean, and it becomes, it's sort of like, well, why would you want to get rid of that? That's so beautiful. And so I was wondering if you could distinguish between that kind of beauty versus the ones that you pointed out in terms of the landscapes of Navajo Nation or Nona Garcia's, like and you've talked a bit about with the mushroom cloud.
I think I will use maybe the Navajo as an example, because this is also, again, this was very challenging for me as a nuclear policy expert that had traditional training in Washington, D.C., to go to the indigenous communities of the Southwest United States. And it was actually a decision that we agreed on together, that this is, as they want to be seen as survivors. They want to be seen as fighters and not victims. And so those photos are intentionally beautiful in a way that shows that there is hope. So that's the other opening, right? Is that images of civil defense and just the consequences of war are important because it gives us fear, but where does hope come from? And at least from the Navajo Project, I've had conversations with Navajo elders and community activists that they shouldn't just be victimized because they are still alive, they're surviving, and they actually are still doing the work to help heal the land. So what does it mean to show this project, get people engaged, and have people or the general public give to them and help with developing or building that hope? So hopefully that answers your question, but I think that it's, there's something to be said of beauty also allows for hope that current dominant images associated with nuclear doesn't really give.
Susan.
Pictures, because as you might notice, we have small art exhibits, which we do twice a year to cover some, to coincide or resonate with some piece of our program. And our next exhibit is actually going to be,
Essentially,
yeah. About which we had ambivalent feelings, but decided that it fit the topic that we're talking about. But yeah, it's a problem.
Okay.
Thank you.
back in 50